Wonderful. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management Pyramid of Intervention. Last year, I had the pleasure of coming to Western Quebec School Board to present on the pyramid, to introduce it, to kind of set the stage for why the benefit behind putting together a pyramid and what's more specific into that document with all of the different resources and so forth. And so today I'm here for a part two. Where do we go from here in terms of, now that we understand what the pyramid is and what's the benefit behind it, the purpose of it, how do we use it? How do we apply it? And I've got some questions to walk you through to make sense of certain elements to consider and so forth. And so I'm really excited to be doing the second part. I will take the time to set the stage and review what I did last year for those who did not hear me speak. And so just to keep in mind that the Pyramid of Intervention, the original one was set up for elementary. I would say about 5 or 6 years ago, my colleague Martine Demers is the one who created the initial document for the Pyramid of Intervention. And ever since then, it has grown and changed and adapted, and we added other documentation. So we decided to adapt it to high school. And more recently, and it's not yet complete, you'll notice on the CEBM website, for those who don't know my website, I'll put into the chat, it's www.cebm.ca is the main website to go and see all of the resources. And so I'm currently working with the team on building a version for K4, K5. There's such a big need for the little ones with all of the challenges, especially K4. And so to be able to adapt that documentation for that age group. The pyramid is basically divided into multiple documentation. One of the documents is looking at the actual practices that we suggest. And we've used the inspiration of the pyramid. The reason why we call it a pyramid is because we're looking at the RTI model. We're looking at having that pyramid where you have the for everybody at tier 1, those universal best practices. Then we're looking at, for some students who need additional support, those tier 2 targeted practices. And then at the tier 3, those individualized few students that we have who really require more personalized and intensified support. And so we've broken down these suggested practices for all, for some, and for few. And so it becomes that pyramid. And we've got different documentation that is proposed for elementary and different that is proposed for high school. I know that I've had some people from adult ed that have come to me to ask if that documentation could be adapted to adult ed. The mandates of the Centers of Excellence are for the youth sector. However, I would strongly invite those that are in adult ed to take the high school version and to adapt it to your needs. I think that there's a good possibility to be able to do that for that population. Now, at the end of last year and at the beginning of this year, we created a new document called the Tier 1 Checklist. We've come to recognize that although the pyramid is very detailed, that sometimes it wasn't always clear to people concretely in the day-to-day what each of these practices would look like. And so not only did we adapt the documentation, we actually put it into 2 columns. So the picture that you have here right now on this slide is actually not the most recent version. We decided to create these documents into 2 columns. And so on the left-hand side, you have the list of the practices. And on the right-hand side, you've got concrete examples of what that would look like in the day-to-day. And what we decided to do to make it even more concrete and detailed is to create a checklist. And so every single section where you have the top there that is green is basically a line within this document here. So every single line is a section in the checklist. And underneath each section, we've got very detailed elements to consider within that one proposition of a practice. And so at the beginning of the year, my Center of Excellence launched a webinar called Let's Start the Year Right. And so for those that are not aware of this recording, I strongly invite you to go and take a look. It is about an hour and some recording. And I walked through the tier one, talking about how do we start off the year right, keeping in mind all of the best universal practices to put in place. And by the way, before I forget, these universal best practices are not something that Martin and Eva and myself have invented. These are best practices coming from years and years of exposure to seeing master teachers put this in place intuitively in their classroom. And so what we've done is we've selected from all of these practices that we've seen over the years that really have really great result with students. We've decided to bring them together to create this list of suggestions. That being said, the list is not exhaustive. I'm sure that there are other practices that master teachers and other skillful teachers will use that are great practices as well. And so I just want, teachers to feel at ease that it's not because that practice is not apparent in the document that it means that that practice should not be utilized. We've selected the most common recommended types of strategies, and so there could be other ones. But what I really love about this document, the tier one checklist, is that now this becomes a working document that not only the teacher could use this in their classroom to walk it through and to kind of see, what are those things that they've put in place and to reassure them that they're on the right track, but also perhaps to give them additional ideas of things they may not have thought of. In terms of the flexible, seating, or in terms of giving, gross motor movement to some of your students, or if they need to have more inclusive practices and so forth. And so I'm not going to walk through today this checklist. There are 6 pages of items there to look at. It's a lot of material. So I would invite you, those that are here, whether you're a resource teacher or an administrator or in whichever other role that you're in, to share this with your school team, to have them become familiar with this document. And by the way, so right now this is the tier one checklist. We are currently working on creating a tier two and a tier three checklist as well. And so as we speak, those two other checklists are not yet available. And so as soon as they will be, I will make sure to have them on the CBM website, and you'll be able to download them and to utilize them. But in the meantime, even though you don't have the tier two and tier three checklist, you do still have the generalized list of these suggested practices. And along with these suggested practices, you have another document and this is what we're going to be doing in part two today. We're going to walk through how to use these practices. How do we know which one to select? Because, like there's at least 16 different suggested practices at each tier. There's no expectation that teachers should be putting in place all 16 at once. It's way too much different practices to keep track on and to see whether or not they have good effect or good benefits on a group. And so I would suggest to start small, to start with 2 practices or 3 practices at the most at once. And as you try these different practices and see how they work, then we would be adding more, either removing some, changing some, or adding some to those that we've already attempted. And so this second document is kind of like a step-by-step sequence on how to use the pyramid of intervention, giving you kind of these reflection questions about, so where do we start? How do we utilize a practice? How do we know if that practice is working? How do we decide that this practice needs to be adjusted? How do we adjust the practice? How do we decide that now it's time to change that practice because it's not working to something else? And the bigger question that I get the most often is, how do I know after have tried all of the tier one universal practices, or most of them, that now it's the time to move up tier and to now attempt either targeted and or individualized practices for those students who need more, that they're not benefiting enough from just tier one universal practices. And so today, this is what I want to do with you. I want to focus on answering all of these different questions. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through from tier one to tier two to tier three all of the common questions that I get for you guys to reflect on the on how to use the document. And I'm also going to perhaps illustrate the use of this document through an example. I'll make up a fictional example of a classroom setting, and to be able to really make it clear and concrete for you on how to kind of walk that through step by step. So let's start our journey walking through the pyramid. And so at tier one, before I get into the actual practices, a lot of the questions that I get around the use of the pyramid of intervention is, when should I refer to the document? Is this a document that I refer to all the time? Or are there times that I should refer to it that are more strategic and more beneficial? And so basically, I would suggest, first of all, and that's why I created that webinar in August about let's start the year right. I do believe that all staff at the beginning of the school year, before the kids come in August and early September, that we take this document as a guide, as a checklist to walk us through as we're setting up the space, as we are looking at the routine, looking at the structure, looking at the physical setup of the space, being intentional in the way that we will set up the room and all of the materials. And so it would be a good idea before the students come in, of course, when you have your class list. And so if these are students that you have that were there, I'm not talking about kids who are just coming in that we don't know, unless you have pre information on these students. I'm talking about students that are already in the building. And so those that have already been there the years before, that we may have previous knowledge on them. And so to get a sense of who's our group, who are these individual students? Are there students in that list that you already know need more than tier one support? That you already know may have a difficulty code, or that the teacher from the previous year may have given you insights on some of the practices that they've done the previous year that works for them, or that doesn't work for them, that triggers them. And so, and not just individual students, but as the year unfolds, especially the first month or so, to be able to make sense of the overall makeup of the group. That too is something that is really important, because not only do individual students need to be considered, but we also need to consider the overall makeup of the group and how they may impact each other. And this will help us decide which of the practices we want to put in place at tier one. And so, yes, the beginning of the year. But then also, as the students come in, today we are October 9th. And so I would say by this point in time now, it would be important, even though teachers have reviewed that document back in August or early September, to reevaluate at this point, are there any students in the group that are struggling right now despite the practices that have been put in place? Are we recognizing that perhaps they need more? And so before we jump the ante and that we start looking at tier two or tier three, we first want to walk through all of what we need to walk through in tier one to assure that we've done everything that we could do, and that we've tweaked these different practices at tier one before we move further. And so part of it is to confirm what you're already doing, but part of it is also for you to assess what you're doing. Is it really well adjusted to the group that you have? And so I put a note down here at the bottom of my slide that says that, of course, these suggested strategies have been tried and true. And so these are not strategies that we don't know whether or not they're impactful. These are these common practices utilized by experienced and seasoned teachers, and that we've gotten over years proof of their impact. However, it's not a one size fits all. And I want to say that this pyramid was never meant to be prescriptive. There's no expectation that teachers should walk through that document list by step like a recipe and apply everything that's there in the way that it's said. You guys are the experts of your own group. And so it's up to the teacher, the support staff, the resource teacher, the administrator as a team, if needed, that you together make sense of for that particular group, for those individual students that make up this group, what makes sense for them. And so it's not a one size fits all, and it's not meant to be prescriptive. We really need to be open and flexible with utilizing these different strategies in the way in which it seems fit to us. And so the way that the pyramid is meant to be used at the first step. And so if we look at the consideration flow chart, that second document that works hand in hand with the list of the different practices, at the top of this document, we're going to walk through it step by step. What I will say there is I'm not talking about at the beginning of the year when we're setting it up. I'm talking about when we're at that point that even though we've set it up and that now we're noticing that for some students it is not enough. And so when faced with a student, and I'm saying a student, but it could be a few students that is struggling in class, now it might be a good idea to look at the Tier 1 Universal Best Practice list that has been suggested, and from that list that we select at least one or two different practices. And so for those that are not familiar with the list of the suggested practices, here they are at Tier 1. Okay, and these are just the overall arching practices. And so I'll walk them through really quickly. And so one of them is to be mindful and intentional in the way that we've set up the physical and social environment, the learning environment. And so thinking about the way we've set up the furniture in the room, the way that we've placed the desks, the way in which we may have thinking about the sensory in terms of the sight, the in terms of the sound. Are we mindful about those students who need to have less stimulation in terms of the neon lights in the classroom, in terms of the cluttering on the walls, in terms and so forth. And so all of that needs to be considered. The second point that we focus on Tier 1 is the adult posture. And so what does that mean to have a strong adult posture? What does that look like? And so going through the checklist will give you more concrete ideas about what it is that we mean in terms of taking the lead of your group, in terms of the way that you will connect with them, in the way in which you will seek to get their attention, to if there are challenges from students, how do we address those challenges and so forth. So we have a whole section that is dedicated to adult posture. The other point that we're covering in Tier 1 is those classroom structures and routines. We're very good at this with younger groups in kindergarten, for example, or in grade 1. But as we get further into age groups, especially in high school and adult ed, we tend to forget the benefits and the values of structures in routines. Students who struggle to manage because of the lack of predictability need to have that structure and routine to be successful. And so how can we walk through that section on structures and routines to be able to see what it is that we haven't thought of? In terms of classroom expectations, sometimes, we think students know, but some students might know, but many students need to have that very explicit time for us to talk about what are the adult expectations for the classroom? What does that look like, a positive learning environment? What are those things that need to be honored? Because of course, not all students can fulfill the expectations in the same way. So we need to have a bit of flexibility there, and we can adapt some of these expectations according to the needs of some students, but ultimately being consistent also in the way that we explain and model and present these expectations. In terms of pedagogical flexibility, inclusive practices, and support measures, these are things that we may not know ahead of time until we have our group and that we become more familiar with them, and we get to see what are their needs, what are their challenges, where do we need to be more flexible, where do we need to adapt some of these teachings, where do we need to consider additional support measures for them to be more successful. And by the way, I have put support measures in Tier 1 because even if we have neurodiversity in the classroom, or that we have students with trauma, and that we are putting support measures specific to their needs because they require those measures. For example, a privacy folder, or it could be, a noise canceling headsets. And so I put it in tier one because even if some students need those practices to be successful, it doesn't mean that the other students who do not require it, who don't need it, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't benefit from it. And so to be able to help the teacher to not have to create individualized strategies for each of the kids, it would be impossible to have these tailor-made plans for every single student in the classroom. And so let's take advantage of using some of these support measures that students absolutely need and propose them to everybody, because we know that other students could still benefit from having those in place. And it will help the teacher to have to focus on the group as a whole rather than having to tailor to each student, which makes it really difficult, almost impossible. The other element that we talk about at tier one is in terms of the cross-curricular development and emotional literacy. And so what I mean by emotional literacy is beyond the social emotional learning. How can we help students become familiar with their emotions, to be attuned to their bodies, to be able to not just recognize their emotions, but to be able to have room to express them, and to have space to be able to walk that through. And I understand, by the time we get in high school, that it makes it really challenging with all of the academics that we need to cover to make space for cross-curricular and emotions. But I am telling you that there is a need at all ages to do this. There is an author, I forget her name right now. It's Mina something, and she wrote a book called SEL Every Day. And in that book, she talks about not just for elementary, but for elementary and high school, and I would include adult ed as well. How can we build in, we can kind of trickle SEL in our day-to-day practices, not necessarily having a block of time dedicated to SEL, but there's a way to be able to include it into some of the other activities, whether learning activities or other, that we're doing with our students. For those who are interested in knowing how to better do this, the emotional accompaniment, I actually did a webinar last year for Eastern Townships on nurturing emotional health and growth. And I take it one step further than social emotional learning. Not all students are capable of learning emotions from a cognitive perspective. Some students, especially those with a history of trauma, have a really hard time managing their big emotions. They need to have a variety in different ways in which we address it, not just through teaching. And so I have tons and tons of recommendations that I have in that presentation that I did, and that recording is available on the CBM website. So I invite you to go and take a look at that. Another point that I walk through in tier one is the flexible classroom options. Not all students do well sitting at a desk and chair all day, every day. They need that movement to be able to focus and to learn. Sometimes we think that the movement for a student is distracting them, and actually could be quite the opposite. It helps them to focus better. And so for us to be mindful of that, and you'll notice, for those who are familiar with the checklist, or when you will become familiar with that checklist, that I mention in there that it's not just about putting a few yoga balls in the room. There's much more that goes with creating an effective, flexible classroom environment. We need to teach these different tools. They need to be introduced. They need to be modeled. We need to explain the proper use of these tools. We need to explain to students that these are not toys, they're tools, and they have a specific purpose, and we are using them for that objective only. And that there's a time and place and frequency in which we use these different tools. And so all of that needs to be thought through. It's not just a question of having, a few, desk cycles in the room, or having a few yoga balls that are available. It's much more complex than that. And the other thing that we need to keep in mind, going back to my point that I said earlier about it's not a one size fits all, It's the same thing with all of these support measures. It's not because a support measure works for Johnny that it's going to work for Sarah. And so it's important to be able as we introduce and model and that the student tries it out, that we see whether or not it's a right fit. And that if it's not a right fit, so let's say, we've tried a yoga ball with Johnny and that type of seat is not working for Johnny, it's not that Johnny would not benefit from having a flexible seat, is that they're not benefiting from the yoga ball. And so maybe we need to look at a different flexible seat. Maybe we could look at a wobble stool, or maybe they need to do something standing, not sitting, or something on the floor. And so we need to be mindful about tweaking these different practices. I'll continue because we have so much more to cover. I'm going to continue walking through the 14 different elements at tier one. The second piece, the other piece, excuse me, is in terms of individual quiet time activities. And I would add this hand in hand with the brain breaks. There's more and more research coming out talking about the benefits of including in our day some respite time to be able to give students time to either move through the physical brain breaks or to get them to center themselves through an individual quiet activity, something through fine motors. And so many teachers will say to me, Catherine, I don't have time to put in place brain breaks or individual quiet time activities. I'm so bogged down with all of the academics, everything that we need to walk through the curriculum that I need to cover. I don't have time for brain breaks. And what my answer oftentimes to teachers is that if we do not give downtime to students to give them respite, we will have on the other end of things much more classroom management and behavior management to do because students will not be at their optimal. And so rather than fighting it on the other end and trying to, impose without breaks, that academic, to be able to give them that respite will allow not only for better focus and for them to be even more efficient in their performance, but it will also minimize the quantity of classroom and behavior management. And so we gain it on the other end. And so how can we put these things in place? What are things to consider and so forth? Another element in terms of giving students respite could be the classroom designated area. And so I know many of you, when I've come to visit your schools or your classrooms, I've seen many schools that do this. Some schools, especially at the high school, don't have a space to be able to set up a corner. And by the way, the corner would look very different at the elementary than it would at the high school. At the elementary, it could be to have a cardboard box or to have a tent where the student can go and cocoon into. At the high school or at adult ed, it could be as simple as having privacy dividers and that there's a desk there with materials, either with noise canceling headsets and for the student to be able to focus. Some classrooms don't have physical space to be able to have a designated area. And so it's possible to be able to set that up either in the hallway or in other alternative places in the building. And so if you are a school that has a nurturing support center, not necessarily for tier one students, but for tier two and three, those could be a place where the student could go to be able to have a bit of break from the rest of the group and to be able to focus on their task at hand. Now, the three last items are emotional release activities. These could be done hand in hand with the social emotional learning. And so it's not just about teaching the information, it's through experiential activities to get them to release that emotion and to discover themselves and their bodies and so forth. And so for those that are familiar with the book Reclaiming Our Students with Hannah Beach, who wrote that book, she provided free along with her book. I'll write it in the chat for those who don't know that book. It's called Reclaiming Our Students. And it's by Hannah Beach. And so I'm sure many of you are familiar with this book already. And so along with the book is the Inside Out Handbook. So it's called the Inside Out Handbook. And in that handbook, Hannah proposes emotional release activities, not just for elementary. She has them adapted from elementary to high school. And so I invite you, that handbook, by the way, is free. And so you guys can go and download it through the Reclaiming Our Students website. And if you put the password to download it for free is the word experience. So I'll just put that into the chat. If you guys go onto I don't know the address for the website, my apologies, it's reclaimingourstudents.com, I think. And so on that website, you can download for free the Inside Out Handbook. And then in terms of having community projects and activity to build that sense of belonging for the group and bringing students outdoors. I know that there's more and more schools now. Pete's is a good example where students are invited to go outside, not just to go play. Students could go outside also to do learning activities and to be able to have that space and that air to be able or to do other types of activities, whether it's gardening or any other types of activities. We recognized during COVID, when it was more difficult with the situation that we were in, many of us brought our students outside, and many of us noticed the benefits of the outdoor time. And so to be able to build that into the schedule, so it's not that we're replacing it, that we're replacing outside from the academics. Academics could happen outside. It's just a question of setting that up. So to go back to the flow chart, and so the first step we would be doing is to select at least one or two of these different elements and to try those out with the group. Now, some of the questions that I get at times is, how about if I have neurodiverse students or students with trauma into my group? Is that taken into consideration? And so I would say to you that all of these different practices that have been selected into the Pyramid of Intervention are not random practices. We have kept in mind the different elements here in terms of the brain, honoring neuroscience in terms of development. So I have a pyramid that is available for K4, K5 that's coming out. I have one for elementary. I've got one for high school. And you'll notice from level to level that I'm honoring where students are at in terms of their development. It is meant to be attachment friendly. Yes, absolutely. Many of these practices are trauma informed, and they also honor neurodiversity. And so the focus is on the student's fundamental needs behind the challenge. It's not about addressing the behavior. It's about understanding what the need is for that student, and that we're setting up through the Pyramid of Intervention the right conditions to answer to that need. That is the purpose of the pyramid. It's not to wait for the student to become dysregulated and to be upset that we intervene. We put these things in place proactively, preventatively, ahead of time. So to be able to answer to those fundamental needs, to not get to try to prevent as best as we can some of these challenges. It doesn't mean that it's going to take away all the challenges, but I strongly believe the more that we do things proactively and preventatively, the more that we're going to minimize these crisis interventions and focusing on putting out fires. So as I mentioned before, at Tier 1, the belief is that all students can benefit from the same universal practices, even if some students need it more than others. And so even if some of these practices are put in place to support trauma or to support neurodiversity, these are still practices that anybody can benefit from. So in terms of neurodiversity, a lot of the challenges that we see with that population is the fact that their sensory gating system does not work very well. Basically, the sensory gating system is their ability to be able to filter the sensory input from their world. And so in terms of sound, in terms of sight, in terms of smell, in terms of touch, in terms of proprioception, there are 7 or 8 different sensory experiences for the individual. And so a neurotypical individual who has a good sensory gating system is able to filter out the noise and do not become overwhelmed by their environment. Whereas the individual who doesn't have a well-functioning sensory gating system easily gets overwhelmed, not only by their physical environment, but also from the social interaction. So if I go back to that point 1 about being intentional in the physical and social setup of the learning environment, If you have an hypersensitive student in your group, if you have an ASD student, if you have a student with a history of trauma, those elements need to be taken into consideration when we are intentionally thinking about the way in which we're going to set up the physical and social environment to be able to help them become more successful. Because we know that for those kids with neurodiversity, because they don't have that good, well functioning filter, all of the way in which they're going to regulate their bodies and to reason the input in their body, it's through the brainstem. And so a neurotypical person who has a good filter does not get flooded in their system, and they have an easier time to be able to regulate themselves and to be able to take a step back and to reason. Whereas an individual who has a compromised sensory gating system, it's almost like as if there's a flooding in their brain. And so they get so inundated by input that it makes it more difficult for them to manage additional stress in the environment. So we need to be really mindful for those students. In terms of trauma, I've presented before on trauma. I believe I've got some recordings available right now. I did a whole presentation on making sense of trauma and how to best support those students. The image that you see right there on the left-hand side is a healthy individual who has not gone through any trauma. So we could see a good development of the brain. We see a well-functioning prefrontal cortex. We can notice here on the right-hand side an individual who has gone through severe abuse and neglect right from after birth. And so the example of this imagery here is from an orphan who was placed in an orphanage and was faced with severe neglect and abuse. And so unfortunately, we could see the lack of development in the brain. It's not that there's true holes there. The matter of the brain is there. It's just not activated. We know now through neuroscience that there's only so much energy that could be put into development. It's either the brain will focus on survival or it will focus on growth. And so if there isn't room for growth because the brain is inundated with needing to survive, then the brain will suffer, will be compromised in their development and growth. And so we could see here the lack of prefrontal cortex. The thing that happens with those individuals when they lack a good functioning limbic system, the limbic system is where the emotions are filtered, and the prefrontal cortex is that those students become very impulsive and they have a hard time having perspective. They have a hard time slowing things down. And similarly to that student who has a compromised sensory gating system, their gating system may not be compromised, but they have such a flooding of triggers that come into their brain that their filter has a hard time being able to slow down the input. And so they too get inundated in their flooding in their brain and have a harder time to regulate themselves and to reason. The other element that we need to take into consideration with our trauma students is that they don't have a well-functioning neuroception. Neuroception is basically the way in which we interpret our world in terms of safety. And so whether our brain is able to pick up if our inner world or outer world or the relationship with others is feeling safe to them on a brain level. So it's not that the adult is not a good, warm, and nurturing, safe person. It's the way in which the child or the adolescent will interpret that sense of safety. And all of this has an impact in the way that they will manage on a day-to-day basis. And so all of these different elements. Oh, I forgot to say, by the way, for those that are there listening to me live, those slides will be shared with you after the presentation. And so you do not need to be taking tons and tons of notes. I will make sure to be sending those slides your way. And for those that are listening to the recording, the slides will be available to download off of the CBM website. So to go back to the concept of neuroception, what happens here is that the student, there's a high chance that they're going to get triggered in their environment, triggered through their five senses, triggered through their interoception. Interoception is basically the way in which your body will feel hunger and pain and pleasure and so forth. It's that inner sensation. In terms of the way emotions will come across to them and the way that their dynamics will impact them, all of these different triggers will impact in the way in which they will manage in the classroom. And so for those students, we need to be very sensitive, yes, of course, of the physical setup of the room, but also the social setup, being careful about which student they're sitting next to, being careful in the way that the adult in their posture will support that student, that the adult themselves are not triggered and that they are able to remain tempered and calm and collected when they're addressing the student who is dysregulated, that they are able to have predictable classroom structures and routines, because without that predictability, this becomes now more stressful for that student. That student may need more downtime because they're so overwhelmed and inundated that that additional downtime for them helps them to be more functional and so forth. And so all of these things need to be taken into consideration. In terms of the way that their stress response, are they the type of student that goes into flight response or fight response, or do they just shut down? And so depending on the way that they will respond to stress, this will give us cues on now how to tailor. So now I'm talking more about tier two here, but I kind of wanted to bring this in because we're talking about trauma here, on how to be able to best support that student depending on the way that they respond to stress. I want to look at this image for a second. And so here, I'll explain this graph to you. So from the bottom left to the bottom right, this axis here is looking at the degree of stress in the environment. So we're looking at from daily challenges to moderate stress to distressful and threatening situations. So we're increasing in terms of degree of stress. From the bottom to the top, we are looking at the emotional and stressful state of the individual, where we go from a state of calm to a state of alert to alarm to fear to terror. If we look at that line here in the middle, this is the neurotypical individual that is not faced with trauma or any, high level of adversity. So you'll notice that their state, their emotional and stressful state, is proportionate to the environment. We can see that they're able to manage in daily challenges, that they're able to stay calm, or perhaps they're alert, but that they're able to manage in just daily challenges. In terms of moderate stress, now they're maybe more alarmed or more afraid. And as we move forward towards the right, it's to be expected that when they're in distressful or threatening situations, that they will be more afraid and terrorized. I want to bring your attention to that line here on the left, that sensitized individual. So in that sensitized category, I'm going to include neurodiversity, hypersensitivity, and I'm going to include trauma. And so you'll notice here at the bottom, just in daily challenges, how quickly they will jump from a state of calm to alert to alarm to fear, and even almost past fear to almost terror. These are the students that we have in the classroom just faced. If we think about what's an example of daily challenge, having a new learning, trying something academically that is really difficult for them, that they don't know how to accomplish, a task they don't know how to accomplish. This will push them really exponentially from a state of calm to alert to alarm to fear. So we need to think about, for those students in that environment, what can we put in place, for example, in our pedagogical flexibility, in our inclusive practices, in our support measures? What do those students need to be able to function just in daily challenges? And of course, then the reaction kind of tapers off to being more anticipated or proportionate to the situation at hand for moderate stress and distress. Now, I want to bring your attention to that line here at the bottom, where we look at the resilient student. The resilient student is basically not just our neurotypical population, but also the sensitized population that have been given the right conditions to be successful. And so look at the bottom. I don't want to focus here on the right. I want to focus here on the left bottom. Look how they're able to manage within daily challenges because they have the right conditions put in place. What I mean by conditions are the elements that I have listed in the pyramid of intervention. These are the conditions. And I want to bring it one step further. The thing that is allowing for those students to become resilient is not only the right conditions, but it's also because those students are feeling safe. Safety is the starting point for any student. No student can function in a classroom if they are not feeling safe. For those that are familiar with the book Beyond Behaviors by Mona de la Hook, I'll write it in the chat. So if it's so many resources that I know of. By the way, if you want to look, I've got a list of them on the CBM website. So it's called Beyond Behaviors by Mona de la Hook. So in that book, in chapter 4, she dedicates a whole chapter to safety needing to be the starting point. The thing about the sense of safety, especially with our trauma population, remember I talked about neuroception? It's not about whether the environment is safe, it's how the brain is interpreting whether or not they're feeling safe. And so it's all about the way in which the primitive part of the brain and the limbic system will interpret whether or not they are feeling safe. And so our job is not to try to convince them that they're safe. This is not a rational experience. This is a very primitive, instinctual experience. We need to go through this through having the right conditions in place in order for them to feel safe. Not only do we need to have the right conditions, but we also need to have the right timing. So I want to look at this slide for a second from Ross Greene. Ross Greene is the author who wrote The Explosive Child. And more recently, he's been doing a lot of presentations on trauma. And this slide, I took it from one of his presentations. He did it last year or 2 years ago now, on the timing in which we use certain strategies. So it's not just the strategy itself, it's the timing in which we use it. And so for our trauma kids, our dysregulated students, for our neurodiverse population, when we expect the student, when they are dysregulated, to, for example, ask for help, to go on their own, to take that break, to go on their own to that designated area, to that calming corner, to go on their own, to access their coping skills, their toolbox. All of these things, when they are dysregulated in the timing, is already too late. A student is not receptive when they are dysregulated. And so even if we've presented these tools and strategies and that we've practiced them, especially for our more vulnerable population, the moment they are dysregulated, they have a hard time accessing these on their own. We need to do it with them. So that's the difference between self-regulation and co-regulation. Those students need for us to be sensitive to the timing and to the accompaniment. And so if we let them on their own do this when they're dysregulated, not only is it too late, but also they cannot do it by themselves without us. And so it's so important not just to think about the different conditions, but the timing and the way in which we bring these conditions forward. And so here are other examples that he's brought up, that when it's too late, when we're at that point of needing to de-escalate the situation, when we're at the point where we need additional support from a colleague because what we're trying to do is not working, the student is now completely shut down or completely oppositional and resistant to us. At that point, there's no going forward from there in that moment. When we're at the point where we need to resort to things like restraints and isolation because things are completely completely chaotic, and that now we're in a dangerous situation. Now we're too late in terms of receptivity of the student. There is no way that we can move forward into applying something that's going to work in that moment. All we're doing is establishing safety at this point. And of course, if we're referring the students to reflect, I know this is a very popular thing in high school to send students to a reflection room or to send students to the principal's office to apply a discipline measure to either put them in detention or suspension. Those students, our vulnerable population, do not learn from these situations. When we send them to the reflection room, they're not going to reflect, especially when they are dysregulated. Talking reflection is the last thing they can do in that moment. We need to be able to connect with them at a lower level. In terms of their sensory experience, in terms of being able to normalize what they're going through, not validate their behavior, but to normalize their emotions behind that, being able to make space for them to talk about their needs and their challenges and so forth. And so all of this needs to be taken into consideration. So, what students need from us, based on everything I've been saying up until now, is basically for us to be intentional in the way that we set up the environment, for us to constantly think about in prevention and in management, in intervention of a situation, think about the safety, the sense of safety, that neuroception for the student, and that sense of belonging. Are they connecting to us in that moment? Are they receptive to us? Or are they resistant to us because there's no connection in that moment to us? And so it's so important then to backtrack and to reconnect with them first before we move forward in our practices. In terms of adjusting our expectations, and according to that, the differences and the needs of those students. So we know that a student with trauma or a student with neurodiversity cannot manage in the same way as a neurotypical individual. How can we compensate for some of these challenges, relying on the structures and routines? So this goes back to the Tier 1 Pyramid of Intervention and some of the elements here through some of these measures to be able to support them and compensate for their needs and challenges. How can we come alongside their stress response? And rather than expecting them to do it on their own when it's already too late, how can we come alongside and co-regulate with them? How can we manage the circumstances when things have escalated rather than trying to control the student's behavior, because we know that there's nothing in that moment, especially with those highly dysregulated individuals, there's nothing we could do in that moment. And to make room for them to be able to express and feel their emotions. The reason why I talk about this is because in order for them to feel safe, it's not just about the physical environment and the relationship that the adult has with the student has with the adult. If we have a student that is shut down emotionally, there is no way that they're going to feel safe. And so, in order to soften some of those defenses, in order to get to that place where they can feel safe, we need to make room for them to be able to feel those emotions and to express them. And without that, then there's no way going forward from there with all of those defenses in place. So the pyramid of intervention not only has it all of these elements in mind, but more generally has the following other considerations in mind, where the pyramid needs to be applied systemically. So it's not just about one teacher using this in their classroom. The more that we can use tier 1 in the classroom to tier 2 in the classroom and other places in the school, where tier 3 is going from the classroom to alternative spaces, and we work together being on the same page, having the same language, the same understanding, this will help to increase the capacity for effectiveness of the strategies and the practices. This needs to be done systemically and preventatively and proactively. So we don't wait for the problem to arise to deal with it and put out fires. We try to learn from those situations and try to address it from a more proactive and preventative basis, answering to those needs rather than addressing the behavior. Being mindful of the adult response in the equation. Yes, our energy levels and our stress response has an impact on the student and vice versa, right? They trigger us too in the way that they are dysregulated and so forth. It is important for us to be attuned to our own stress level in those situations. And if we're not in a place where we can respond properly to a student, then it's the time to count on our colleagues to work together as a team to support those students, to share that weight, and to be able to help each other out. Because, you know, from experience, when the same individual, whether a teacher or a support staff or an administrator or a resource teacher or any other teacher, any other staff, excuse me, in the building, no single adult can handle full-time a highly challenging student on a daily basis full-time. We're not meant to do this alone. We're meant to do this as a village. And so how can we work together as a team to be able to increase the effectiveness of the strategies, but also to protect both the student and the adults? You know, how many adults we have that go on burnout or that change careers because they are in impossible situations that are not made to be set up in the way that they are. And so the pyramid of intervention in tier 2 and 3, and even in tier 1, it's meant to be shared. It's not meant to be on the shoulders of one single person. And of course, if we have a common vision and that we work as a team and that we've got that good communication between us, oh my goodness, how this approach will be so much more effective. So I want to use a concrete example to walk you through, a fictional example to walk you through how to utilize the pyramid of intervention. So let's say we're at the beginning of the school year and we have, let's use a grade 2 group. So we have a grade 2 group and we might be familiar with some of the students, not all. I think some students might be new to the school. We, of course, don't know yet the composition of the group because they were not the same group last year. The students were reshuffled. And so there's a time and place to be able to get familiar with the individual students and to know the makeup of the group. However, we do have information from the teacher from grade 1 that there's a few students in the classroom that may have a history of trauma and that their current situation is really not stable right now at home, that they have parents that have outside services involved and that are really struggling to manage their children at home. Let's say in that group, we also have a couple autistic kids that are very hypersensitive to sensory and that they're having a hard time managing without us being intentional with the setup of the room. So just knowing these few elements that we have in hand, perhaps some of the strategies that I might focus on right off the bat first thing in the year is to really be mindful of the physical and social setup of the learning environment, making sure that students are not bunched up together too closely, that we've orchestrated the way in which the seating arrangement has been optimized to not fit certain students next to each other because we know that they get themselves into trouble if they're sitting next to each other, that we are being very mindful about the classroom structures and routines, thinking about how when they first come in the morning, that we don't just start with the lesson, that we give them time to be able to progressively through, it could be some sort of warming group activity or whatever that is that you decide to do, that we progressively help them transition from first thing in the morning, whether coming from the bus or daycare or being in the schoolyard, to now being in the classroom. And that's going to be consistent in that routine to help our kids, for example, with that trauma, because without that predictability, it makes it really difficult. The other thing that we might think of really being mindful about is that flexible pedagogy, those inclusive practices and those support measures. So for example, I might think about including into my classroom a bin with noise canceling headsets or with privacy folders to allow for students when they need it to be able to use those privacy folders to work on that activity that they're working on those individual tasks. I might maybe, in terms of inclusive practices, think about when I'm giving the learning to have a variety of different ways in which I will teach. So not just focusing on auditory processing, but focusing on having visuals and all sorts of other things to be able to include, let's say, our autistic kids and so forth. And so let's start there. So we have those 3 practices that are put in place. So now I'm wondering, my next question is, how do I know if these practices are suitable for the students that I've selected? And so as I've been mentioning, as we've been walking through this, of course, not all practices are suitable for everybody or beneficial to or needed by everybody, should I say. And so we are trying out, it's a lot through trial and error and to see, which practices we're trying out, are they beneficial or are they not? But before we decide whether or not they are effective and before we change it, we need to, first of all, keep into consideration the variety of needs in the group, and that we're able to look at the simultaneous challenges that we may have at once in one group. So if we think about that teacher, that in her same group, she has 2 or 3 students that have a history of trauma, and she has 2 students that have that are autistic, and then there are other kids that she doesn't even know yet and familiar with. Where do we start? Like, how do we even know? Do we address the trauma? Do we address the neurodiversity? Like, where do you start? Do you address everything at once? It makes it really difficult and overwhelming and confusing when we've got so many individual needs in one group to address everything at once. You cannot do that. And so ideally, we would start with priorities. What are those needs that we see that are really kind of intense there in the group that need to be addressed first? And then we need to look at not just the students themselves in the micro, but also look at the macro in which students may impact each other in terms of how things are set up with the families at home. Thinking about the parents as well, because they have a contribution to be done towards these practices. So figuring out where do we start? There's no recipe for this. And so we need to figure out for each classroom, with all of these needs, I think it would be important to create some sort of document illustrating a portrait of your group, a portrait of some of these individual students, being able to list some of these challenges, figuring out, beyond those different issues, how do we put them in order of priority? What do we address first? How do we address them and so forth? So all of that needs to be taken into consideration. And all of that will help us decide which practices are suitable when. Because let's say I'm focusing on trauma first, and that we're thinking about putting in place physical and social environment that has been intentional for them. We're focusing on that now, and of course, all kids can benefit from having that in place. But this is where, as we're moving forward in the different tier 1 practices, as we're walking through the micro and the macro, this will help inform us as to what is suitable when, and which priority we give it. So now if we continue with the pyramid, the flow chart, after we've attempted those 3 steps, so we've looked at the physical and social setup of the room, we've looked at the structures and routines, and we've looked at the pedagogical flexibility, inclusive practices, and support measures. And we're noticing that even though we've put those 3 things in place, that those are not enough for some students in the group. And so now we need to ask ourselves the following questions. Has the need and purpose of those measures that we've put in place, have those been explained to the student and to the parents? It's important to get buy-in from the students to be able to explain the need and the purpose of what we're doing. So we're not just doing things randomly, we're being intentional in the way that we're doing things, and that we are explicitly sharing with them why we're doing what we're doing. And sometimes that helps with buy-in. And so is there buy-in, as a second question, from the student to wanting to try out that intervention? Are the parents on board as well to help encourage and support that measure? And so it's important for us to have an answer to that question, because if we don't have that buy-in, then we need to backtrack for a second to work on building that rapport and getting them to get to that place of wanting to be on board with that specific type of strategy. If they are not on board, perhaps it's not a well-suited strategy and we need to change it or tweak it. But before we get to that thought process, we first need to walk through the questions step by step. For those students that, let's say it's a student that we don't know of that is new to the school, or that, let's say that they, are just not familiar to you. So one question could be, are you familiar with that student's confidential file? Many times there are a lot of very important, vital, relevant information in that student's file. Sometimes there are reports that have been written by professionals for us to become more familiar with their needs and so forth. Oftentimes these are steps that we skip and that we forget to do. To be able to slow this down, when I work with nurturing support centers and that we do student cases, oftentimes I will ask the core team running the nurturing support center to become familiar with the student the confidential file with all of those students that are attending their nurturing support center. Because without that information, how can we have insight on that child's need, on that child's challenge? Maybe there's been recommendations in the past about what works and what doesn't. And so important for us to go and look at that file. And then the following point is, have other staff members who have worked with the student in the past been consulted? What has been successful in the past? What could be potential triggers? And so that's another thing, you know, from year to year to year, I've come to notice that sometimes staff start from the beginning and do not consult their colleagues from previous years to get that insight. Oh my goodness, is it important, that communication, especially with staff that know these students and know what works and what doesn't. I'm mindful that there's about a minute left before break time. I'm just going to walk through this slide, and we'll take a quick break. We'll take about 10 minutes. So the next question is, has the same strategy been tried in different frequency and intensity, considering the length of that intervention, considering the group size and makeup, in terms of the number of times that this is being applied in a week, in terms of the number of weeks in which this has been implemented? So for example, if we go back to the strategies that we've used, let's say that in our support measures, we've used, I don't know, noise canceling headsets. And so with those noise canceling headsets, have we thought about the when, the where, the how long, and so forth of that strategy before we decide that it's not a good strategy? Have we walked through the different elements, considered all of those different pieces? Has the same strategy been tried at different times of the day or different days of the week, or the different activity in which this is happening? And so sometimes that will make a difference. Has the same strategy been tried in a different variety of ways? So for example, if let's say we were talking about brain breaks, and that all we're doing in brain breaks are high level intensity activities, maybe some kids don't do well with high level intensity activities. Maybe it dysregulates them further. And so maybe we need to incorporate these more grounding, low level energy activities for that group. Let's say we're talking about flexible seating option. I mentioned that already before. Maybe it's not the yoga ball. Maybe we need to look at another tool, and so forth. In terms of has the same strategy been tried out with the support and collaboration of another adult? And so sometimes we've walked through a strategy, and sometimes we don't realize it, but it's our own stress level and energy that is nullifying the benefit of that strategy. And so sometimes to attempt it with a different adult in a different space can help us gain perspective and to try it differently. And last but not least, for this first section, once we've walked through every single of these questions and we've answered, yes, I have, yes, I have, yes, I have, now it would be time to try out additional support measures different from the ones we've tried. And so, for example, we could add on making it one step further in terms of engaging students and brain break activities to see if adding those two additional strategies to the ones we've already put in place can help increase that effectiveness. And so at that place, after we've tried those extra two and walked through all of them together, now we need to ask ourselves, after I've tried all 5 of them and that I've walked through step by step these questions, are these working for me? And so if we haven't gone through all the steps, go back. But if we have and it's still not working for me, now we'll be getting to the next step. But if it does work for me, then at that point, we will stick to those strategies until something else can happen. But that would be the step by step. So I will stop sharing for a second. We will pause the recording, take a short break, and then we will get back to part 2 of this presentation.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Maybe 10, 15 minutes. Does that sound okay with you?
Perfect.
Okay, so we'll have everyone back around 10:30 or so.
Perfect. And if ever there's people want to put in some questions in the